Recent investigative reporting seems to confirm what many of us on the left have long feared. President Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Justice Department actually slow-walked multiple early attempts to investigate Donald Trump and his supporters for trying to overturn the 2020 election and January 6th out of fear that they'd be accused of bias and partisanship. Thank God none of that happened anyway, right? Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So one of the common claims that you'll hear from Republican officials, conservative thought leaders, and many right-wing constituents is the idea that President Biden's Justice Department is unfairly biased or partisan in a way that hurts Republicans and conservatives. Now, there's little to no evidence to support that claim, especially since the FBI, which is the main organ of the Justice Department, is led by a Trump-appointed Republican, Christopher Wray, and has only ever been led by Republicans, and is mostly populated by conservatives and Republicans who tend to enter law enforcement at greater rates than liberals and progressives. But recent investigative reporting from the Washington Post seems to indicate that actually there is a bias and a partisanship of sorts at the Justice Department, but in a way that benefits Donald Trump and the Republican Party by default. And I want to dive into this because this is a fear that many on the left, to one extent or another, have voiced, myself included. And we'll dive into this article. It's called "The FBI Resisted Opening Probe into Trump's Role in January 6th for More Than a Year." And it's a very long article, and we won't read all of it. We're going to skim through a bit of it, point out some interesting excerpts, and then get into some reactions. But basically, the fear is that Merrick Garland, who is, so he was initially President Obama's choice to replace Antonin Scalia, the conservative Supreme Court justice who died in 2016, and Republican senators famously refused to have a hearing, so he couldn't be heard, he couldn't be confirmed. And then President Biden thought he'd be a great choice for Attorney General. And in many ways, Merrick Garland is a great choice for Attorney General. Merrick Garland is thoughtful, he's intelligent, he's deliberate, he's measured, he's all the great things that if there was business as usual in the United States, I think he would be an unimpeachable choice. But because it's not business as usual in the United States, and one of the two political parties, the Republican Party, is a bad faith, disloyal opposition party with no limiting principle and a fascist animus driving them, you need a pit bull, a Rottweiler in that position, somebody who would take an aggressive role. And Merrick Garland hasn't been that. He's a brilliant attorney, a brilliant judge. He has a long history of successful prosecutions, even before he became the Attorney General. I mean, he was involved in the case that, convicted the Unabomber, for God's sakes. I mean, Merrick Garland knows what he's doing. But Merrick Garland is so timid in certain ways and so slow that a lot of people on the left, including people who, like Glenn Kirshner, who was a former DOJ official himself and is otherwise a big fan of Merrick Garland, was getting frustrated all this time. Like, dude, where are you at? Why are you taking your time here? Well, this WAPO article kind of goes into detail. A Washington Post investigation found that more than a year would pass before prosecutors and FBI agents jointly embarked on a formal probe of actions directed from the White House to try to steal the election. Even then, the FBI stopped short of identifying the former president as a focus of that administration. A wariness about appearing partisan, an institutional caution, and clashes over how much evidence was sufficient to investigate the actions of Trump and those around him all contributed to the slow pace. Garland and the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco charted a cautious course aimed at restoring public trust in the department, while some prosecutors below them chafed, feeling top officials were shying away from looking at the evidence of potential crimes by Trump and those close to him. And as a matter of fact, at one point, they say down here that you couldn't even... Inside justice, however, some lawyers have complained that the Attorney General's determination to steer clear of any claims of political motive has chilled efforts to investigate the former president. You couldn't use the T word, said one justice official briefed on prosecutors' discussions. This account is based on internal documents, court files, congressional records, handwritten contemporaneous notes, and interviews with more than 24 current and former prosecutors, investigators, and others with knowledge of the probe. Most of the people interviewed for this story spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal decision-making related to the investigation. And then spokespeople at the Justice Department and FBI declined to comment. Guys, this is huge. And again, this article goes into vivid detail, has excerpts of interviews, and provides more firsthand evidence. But it's really bothersome. And again, we kind of see it in a way with the indictment of Trump himself, right? And I think I've mentioned this. I know I've mentioned this in my collaborations with Luke Beasley. I've mentioned this in discussions with Destiny. And I think I've mentioned this in previous videos as well. Trump's own indictment and the assignment of a special counsel to Jack Smith to investigate Donald Trump. The FBI and the Department of Justice bent over backwards to accommodate this man in a way they simply never would have anybody else. For over a year and a half, negotiating with the return of documents that he was not allowed to have in the first place, an issuing of a subpoena. It took nearly 2 years for Merrick Garland to appoint a special counsel. Whereas with his boss, the current sitting president, Joe Biden, within weeks of learning that Joe Biden had also had classified documents at his residence, which he discovered himself and then returned voluntarily. He didn't need to be instructed or requested to have those documents returned. Joe Biden and his attorneys did it in and of themselves on their own volition. Merrick Garland assigned a special counsel to his own boss immediately. Like that, he bends over backwards to accommodate Trump. And for to give the appearance of nonpartisanship, he immediately throws his boss, President Biden, to a special counsel. And Mehdi Hassan, who's a great progressive commentator, he's commented on this as well. He referred to the assignment of Merrick Garland as the Attorney General as an unforced error that President Biden made. Peter Strzok, who was part of the Crossfire Hurricane and Mueller investigation into Donald Trump, he's, of course, furious. He said, this is a quote, an excerpt from the article, the Justice Department's painstaking approach to investigating Trump can be traced to Garland's desire to turn the page from missteps, bruising attacks, and allegations of partisanship in the department's recent investigations of both Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election, of which Strzok played a role, and Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server. As Peter Strzok said, turn the page from legitimate investigations? Turns out partisan attacks work. Pathetic. Do your job as we did ours. Jennifer Rubin, another commentator, said the FBI's Director Wray should be fired, and we who criticized Garland for a year were right. There was also an interview conducted with, I think it's Anthony Weissman by MSNBC. MSNBC's Nicole Wallace interviewed Andrew Weissman, a former senior prosecutor who worked for Robert Mueller during the investigation into President Trump's ties with Russia. There's some quotes associated with this conversation. Inherently political. The decisions have been made thus far were inherently political. Where the Barr Justice Department was aggressively, proactively political through its actions, the Garland Justice Department has been equally political through inaction and through reluctance. If there was truly a culture, as Carroll reports, that saying Trump was taboo and that they were walking on eggshells because of who had committed the crime, which is a political culture. And then Weissman, again, that former prosecutor, points out, I completely agree that if you have what you think is a noble intent to restore and you're trying to depoliticize what Attorney General Bill Barr did to the department, the answer is not appeasement, Weissman explained. History has never shown that appeasement is the answer. I agree with you that it's taking politics into account when you decide that you're going to create a higher standard before you look at somebody who's committed a crime. According to the Washington Post, over and over again, the department's leadership was saying no to an investigation, he continued. That is inherently political. Obviously, it's not on the same plane, not on the same level as what Attorney General Barr did, where you're actively going to arrest people because of politics, but not going after people is also a real wrong, and we're suffering the consequences of it now because there's been a delay, and as Carroll rightly said, there's a race with the clock in terms of what Jack Smith is doing. This is a problem. This is a huge problem, and this goes to my long-standing frustration with institutionalist fetishists, people who not just respect institutions, which you should, right? Institutions help create legitimacy, and they should be preserved and entrusted as much as possible, but they're not perfect. They're not above reproach. They're not beyond reproach, and they're simply a means to an end. And in this situation, we have, Merrick Garland, who I think has clearly demonstrated that he's probably an institutionalist to a fault, is actually not even deferring to the institution itself. That's the sad thing. So Merrick Garland has famously said in multiple press conferences that they will pursue charges without fear or favor. Well, clearly, based on this reporting from multiple credible sources, there was fear. There was fear. Not so much favor, but fear. And actually, there was favor to an extent to Donald Trump because they wanted to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Now, listen, I'm not saying that it's unreasonable for the Attorney General or an FBI director to have that perception on their mind, because you do want public trust in the FBI. But don't pretend that you're above politics, right? When you're making these decisions which benefit Donald Trump, you are making, as Weissman points out in the Raw Story article too, reacting to the Washington Post article, you are making political considerations. You are bending over backwards to accommodate a political actor. And your intentions are certainly noble. Merrick Garland's doing it for the right reason. He's saying, look, I'm showing you how much rope I'm giving somebody who is, in many cases, my boss's political enemy. Look at how objective I am. Look at how fair I'm being. Look at how generous I'm being. But it's not being respected. That generosity, that so-called fairness against really not fair when you have a disproportionate standard, right? When you hold President Biden to a different standard than Donald Trump, that's not fair. But that generosity, that magnanimity of Merrick Garland, hoping that if he does that, people will take the FBI and the Department of Justice more seriously, we have no reason to believe that that's the case. Republicans think that, it's like 80% of Republicans, according to recent polling, believe that the charges against Donald Trump are politically motivated. Nearly half of the country, as a matter of fact, nearly half of the country, 47% according to a recent polling, believe that the charges have a political motivation behind them. So what has Merrick Garland done? What's Merrick Garland's efforts actually built here? What has it done? Because the fact of the matter is we are so divided that there's nothing Merrick Garland could do, nothing, that would make a statistical difference to persuade Republican voters that the DOJ and the FBI is on the up and up. You might have dozens or hundreds or perhaps even thousands that you could persuade, but in terms, the Republican Party is millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of people. Even the MAGA contingent, you're talking about millions upon millions of people. Do you think that Merrick Garland can do or say anything, literally anything, to convince the MAGA cult that the Justice Department and the FBI are above reproach, or at least operating with integrity? The polling would seem to indicate no. And Garland has had a thankless task, and as a result of his timidity, we are running down the clock. Now you can say, well, listen. Again, he's a brilliant attorney. He's allowed Jack Smith to do what he's done. And listen, I'm not here to say that Merrick Garland is a bad attorney general. He's not. I'm saying that there are some things about him that in this context make him weak. Other areas, he's more than capable and an exemplar of what an attorney general should be. But an attorney general should also be mindful of the context, right? Donald Trump, they obviously knew that there was evidence that Donald Trump was involved with an attempt to overthrow the election and to stage a coup. You don't drag your feet for a year over that, hoping that it will buy you some grace or some credibility from that man's cult. That's what the left is frustrated about. We're not asking, we don't want, not only are we not asking, we do not want, we reject the idea that Donald Trump should be denied due process. He was always entitled to due process. But that doesn't mean you drag it out for a year. Just go, well, maybe if we take our time. No, do it now. Think of how Brazil is reacting to when their former leader, Jair Bolsonaro, his supporters attempted a coup. They reacted within weeks. People were fired within weeks. People were put on administrative leave within weeks. Investigations were opened within weeks, formal investigations. The president was vowing, the new president, Lula da Silva, was vowing to hold all accountable or all involved accountable. The Supreme Court got involved. Now, again, there's no evidence that any of the people who are targeted by these investigations are being denied due process, to which, again, they're entitled. But you're not obligated to just drag it out. You don't owe people that simply because they're Republican. So the fact of the matter is, there is actually evidence that President Biden's Justice Department is politically biased, but it's politically biased in a way which favors Trump and the Republican Party. And as a result, I think Jack Smith's job is going to be that much harder because we're heading into an election season, and Donald Trump has already vowed vengeance if he gets back into the Oval Office. So we'll see what happens, but this is a very sobering article of investigative reporting by the Washington Post, and I encourage you to check it out.